Welcome to today's episode of Healing Through Stories, where consciousness meets narrative to create profound transformation. Tonight, we journey into the intricate psychology of those who give endlessly, who carry the weight of others' needs as their own sacred responsibility, and who discover that true service begins with nurturing the caretaker within in the space between sleeping and waking. Stories live that hold the power to transform our deepest patterns. Tonight, consciousness shifts to receive wisdom through a tale that speaks to the soul of every caretaker, every giver, every person who has forgotten that they too deserve the tender care they so freely offer to others. There exists a realm where healing happens through narrative, where the subconscious mind opens like a flower to receive the nutrients of new understanding. In this ethereal space, we meet those who have made caring for others their life's work, their identity, their sacred calling, and who are ready to discover that the most profound act of service is learning to care for themselves with the same devotion they show to everyone else. Beyond the veil of ordinary awareness, transformation awaits for those who have spent lifetimes pouring from empty cups, who have believed that their worth comes from what they can give rather than simply from who they are. In the quantum field of possibility, your story begins not as the rescuer, not as the one who fixes, but as the one who learns to receive the very healing they have been offering to the world. Where time bends and healing flows, we find our character emerging from the mists of eternal giving, stepping into a new understanding of what it means to truly serve. Through the portal of imagination, truth reveals itself, that the caretaker's greatest gift is not their endless giving, but their willingness to model wholeness, to demonstrate that caring for oneself is not selfish but essential, not weakening, but strengthening. In dimensions unseen, your journey toward wholeness unfolds like a sacred manuscript written in the language of the heart. Beyond the boundaries of linear time, healing stories emerge that speak to the tender places where compassion meets exhaustion, where love meets depletion, where the impulse to heal others meets the desperate need to heal oneself. Tonight, we enter the sacred space of narrative where transformation becomes possible, where the caretaker's journey is honored not as a burden to be released, but as a gift to be refined. Here, in this liminal space between conscious and unconscious, between self and other, between giving and receiving, we discover that the most powerful healing happens when we learn to include ourselves in the circle of our own compassion. The universe conspires to bring you this story, to offer you this moment of recognition, this opportunity to see yourself reflected in the journey of another who has walked the path of endless giving. As we begin, know that every word is chosen specifically for you, every metaphor carefully crafted to speak to the part of you that has forgotten its own needs in service of others. In the gentle rhythm of this narrative, your nervous system can begin to relax, your defenses can soften, and your heart can open to receive the very love you have been giving so freely to others. This is not a story about stopping your care for others, but about expanding it to include the most important person in your world, yourself. Her name was Sophia, and she lived in a world where the needs of others created a symphony that played continuously in the background of her consciousness. At 37, she had built a life that revolved around the gentle art of tending to her aging mother's medical appointments, to her sister's children during family crises, to her colleagues who sought her wisdom during their difficult moments, to her community through countless volunteer hours at the local shelter. Sophia's small apartment overlooked the community garden where she spent her early mornings before the rest of the world awakened. Her neighbors knew her as the woman who always had time to listen, who remembered everyone's birthdays, who appeared with homemade soup whenever someone fell ill. Her kitchen counter was permanently cluttered with cards from grateful friends, photos of children she had helped raise, and a calendar so full of other people's appointments that she had forgotten to schedule time for herself. The morning light filtered through her kitchen window as she prepared breakfast, not for herself, but for Mrs. Chen next door, who had been struggling since her husband's passing. Sophia's own coffee grew cold as she focused on making the perfect blend of congee and gentle conversation that would brighten her neighbor's day. This was her daily ritual, this immediate shift from her own needs to the needs of others, as natural, as breathing, and just as unconscious. Her childhood bedroom had been transformed into a makeshift office where she managed the complex web of responsibilities she had inherited and chosen. Charts tracking her mother's medications covered one wall, while another held a whiteboard listing her sister's children's schedules, her friends' therapy appointments, and her own commitments to various charitable organizations. The only personal item in the room was a small, dusty journal that hadn't been opened in months, a gift from herself that she had never found time to use. Sophia's days flowed like a river that had forgotten its own banks, always moving toward other shores. She woke before dawn to prepare for everyone else's day, spent her lunch hours running errands for family members, and fell asleep to the sound of her phone buzzing with messages from people who needed her guidance, her presence, her endless capacity to hold space for their struggles. Yet beneath the surface of her carefully orchestrated life of service, something stirred, a whisper of longing that appeared in quiet moments like morning dew. It was the soft voice that wondered what it would feel like to be cared for with the same dedication she offered others. It was the gentle inquiry that arose when she saw her reflection in the bathroom mirror and realized she couldn't remember the last time she had looked at herself with the same loving attention she gave to everyone else. The whisper grew stronger during her solitary drives between appointments, in the space between helping others and returning home to plan the next day's helping. It was a voice that didn't criticize her caring nature, but wondered if perhaps her capacity to love could expand to include herself. It was a curiosity about what would happen if she applied the same compassion to her own tired body, her own weary spirit, her own dreams that had been placed on hold indefinitely. Sophia's apartment was filled with gifts from grateful friends and family, flowers, books, artwork created by children she had mentored, but there was nothing that spoke to her own desires, her own aesthetic preferences, her own need for beauty and comfort. She had become so skilled at anticipating others' needs that she had lost touch with her own internal compass, her own sense of what brought her joy independent of how it served others. Her wardrobe consisted entirely of practical clothes chosen for their ability to hide stains from cooking for others, to provide comfort during long hospital visits, to project competence during crisis management. She couldn't remember the last time she had chosen clothing simply because it made her feel beautiful, simply because it expressed something about who she was beneath all the roles she played. In the evening hours, when the day's caretaking was complete, Sophia would find herself sitting in her small living room, surrounded by the evidence of her service to others, wondering why she felt so empty despite giving so much. The paradox of her existence was becoming impossible to ignore. The more she gave, the more depleted she felt. Yet the more depleted she felt, the more she believed she needed to give to justify her existence. The world that contained Sophia's life was built on an invisible architecture of need and response, where every relationship functioned as a series of emergencies that required her immediate attention. The city where she lived seemed designed to amplify the urgency of others' struggles while muffling her own internal voice, creating a constant background hum of responsibility that never allowed for true rest. Her neighborhood existed in a state of perpetual crisis that somehow never resolved. Despite her consistent interventions, Mrs. Chen's grief renewed itself daily, requiring fresh comfort. Her sister's children faced new challenges each week that demanded Sophia's wisdom and presence. Her mother's health created an endless stream of appointments and concerns that positioned Sophia as the family's unofficial medical coordinator. The community center where Sophia volunteered was a haven for those seeking support, but it was also a place where her own needs disappeared entirely. The moment she walked through its doors, she transformed from a person with her own inner life to a resource for others' healing. The other volunteers looked to her for guidance, the clients sought her out for her gentle presence, and the staff relied on her to fill gaps in their programming. Even the physical spaces in her life seemed to reflect this pattern of self-effacement. Her apartment was comfortable but impersonal, furnished with items chosen for their practicality rather than their beauty. Her bedroom was sparse, containing only the essentials needed for rest between days of service. Her kitchen was fully equipped for preparing meals for others, but contained little that spoke to her own culinary preferences. The garden outside her window served as a metaphor for her existence, carefully tended, beautiful to others, but somehow lacking the wild, untamed growth that comes from following one's own natural instincts. Every plant was chosen for its ability to serve others, herbs for healing, vegetables for sharing, flowers for gifting. There was no corner of the garden that existed purely for her own enjoyment, no secret space where she could simply be without. Serving her social circle was a complex web of people who loved her for what she could provide rather than for who she was beneath all the giving. Conversations inevitably turned to their challenges, their needs, their struggles, while her own inner world remained largely invisible to those around her. She had become so skilled at redirecting attention away from herself that many people knew her for years without ever learning about her dreams, her fears, her longings. The rhythm of her days was dictated by others' schedules, others' crises, others' needs. She had lost touch with her own natural rhythms, her own need for solitude, her own desire for spontaneity. Her calendar was a monument to availability, with every moment planned around someone else's requirements, while her own body and spirit operated on borrowed time. The emotional climate of her world was one of perpetual emergency, where every phone call might bring news of someone who needed her intervention. She had trained herself to be always ready, always available, always prepared to drop everything in service of others' urgent needs. This constant state of readiness had become a form of hypervigilance that left her nervous system in a perpetual state of activation. Yet within this world of endless giving, small signs of her own nature persisted like wildflowers growing through concrete. The way she hummed while washing dishes revealed a musical soul that had been silenced by constant service. The book stacked beside her bed spoke of a mind hungry for ideas and stories that had nothing to do with problem solving. The art supplies hidden in her closet whispered of a creative spirit that had been sacrificed to the demands of practical caretaking. The seasons changed around her, but Sophia barely noticed. So focused was she on the human weather of others. Emotional states. Spring brought new crises. Summer intensified existing problems. Autumn created fresh challenges. And winter deepened everyone's need for her warmth and attention. She had become disconnected from the natural cycles that might have reminded her of her own need for rest, renewal, and regeneration. Her financial life reflected this pattern of self-neglect, with her resources consistently directed toward others' needs while her own retirement, her own security, her own dreams remained unfunded. She had become an expert at stretching resources to serve others while living in a state of constant scarcity that she justified as necessary sacrifice. The media she consumed, the books she read, the conversations she engaged in all reinforced the narrative that her value came from her ability to serve, to fix, to heal others. She had surrounded herself with information that confirmed her identity as a caretaker while providing no models for self-care, no examples of people who had learned to balance giving with receiving. The patterns of Sophia's life revealed themselves, like archaeological layers, each stratum telling the story of how she had constructed her identity around the needs of others. Her morning routine was a masterpiece of self-abandonment disguised as productivity, rising before dawn not to greet the day with her own intentions, but to begin the complex choreography of anticipating and meeting others' needs. The first sound she heard each morning was not her own heartbeat or the bird song outside her window, but the mental checklist of everything she needed to do for others. Before her feet touched the floor, her mind was already cataloging her mother's medication schedule, her sister's childcare needs, her neighbor's grocery requirements, and the various crises that might emerge throughout the day. Her breakfast ritual had become a metaphor for her entire existence. She prepared elaborate, nutritious meals for others while subsisting on whatever remained, usually cold coffee and a piece of toast consumed while standing at the counter, reading text messages from people who needed her attention. The act of sitting down to eat had become foreign to her, as if taking time to nourish herself was an indulgence. She couldn't afford. The way she answered her phone revealed the depth of her programming. Immediate availability, regardless of what she was doing, regardless of her own state of mind or body. Her voice automatically shifted to the tone of someone ready to help, to listen, to solve whatever problem was being presented. She had trained herself to be perpetually interruptible, perpetually available, perpetually ready to set aside her own needs for the urgent demands of others. Her daily movements through the world were choreographed around others' schedules and needs. She shopped for groceries with multiple lists, one for her mother's dietary restrictions, one for her sister's children's preferences, one for Mrs. Chun's traditional favorites, and finally, a small notation for her own basic needs. She moved through stores like a professional caretaker, her own desires secondary to her responsibilities to others. The evening hours revealed the most profound pattern. The way she processed her day not through the lens of her own experiences, but through the measurement of how well she had served others. Her internal dialogue was a constant evaluation of whether she had done enough, given enough, been available enough. She measured her worth not by her own growth or happiness, but by the satisfaction and comfort she had provided to others. Her sleep patterns had been hijacked by the hypervigilance of constant caretaking. She kept her phone by her bed, always ready to respond to middle-of-the-night emergencies. Her dreams were populated by the problems of others, her subconscious mind working overtime to solve difficulties that weren't even her own. She woke tired, having spent the night emotionally processing other people's lives. The way she spoke about herself revealed the depth of her self-neglect. She used language that minimized her own needs while amplifying the importance of others' struggles. Phrases like, "It's nothing," "I'm fine," and "Don't worry about me" had become her automatic responses to any inquiry about her own well-being. She had developed a sophisticated vocabulary for dismissing her own needs, while remaining exquisitely attuned to the subtle needs of others. Her financial patterns mirrored her emotional ones. Money flowed out to support others' needs, while her own security remained precarious. She had developed an elaborate system of justification for this imbalance, telling herself that she needed less, that she was stronger, that she could manage with whatever remained after everyone else had been cared for. The way she navigated conflict revealed another layer of her programming. Her immediate instinct was to absorb tension, to smooth over difficulties, to take responsibility for others' emotional states. She had become skilled at managing other people's feelings while remaining largely unconscious of her own emotional landscape. Anger was foreign to her, frustration was quickly suppressed, and disappointment was reframed as an opportunity to give more. Her relationship with time was perhaps the most revealing pattern of all. She existed in a state of perpetual rush, always behind schedule because she had filled every moment with obligations to others. She had no concept of personal time, no boundaries around her availability, no understanding of rest as anything other than preparation for the next day's service. The physical symptoms of her lifestyle were becoming impossible to ignore. Chronic fatigue that no amount of caffeine could mask, tension headaches that arrived with predictable regularity, and a general sense of running on empty that had become her normal state. Her body was trying to communicate something important about the unsustainability of her current patterns, but she had learned to override these signals in service of others' needs. The roots of Sophia's caretaking identity stretched back to a childhood where love was conditional upon her ability to anticipate and meet others' needs. At 7 years old, she had discovered that her mother's unpredictable moods could be stabilized through careful attention and service. The household anxiety that permeated their small apartment could be temporarily soothed when Sophia took on responsibilities beyond her years, helping with younger siblings, managing household tasks, serving as an emotional barometer for the family's well-being. Her father's absence had created a vacuum that she had learned to fill through hypervigilance and service. She became the family's unofficial therapist, the one who listened to her mother's fears and frustrations, who absorbed the emotional overflow that had nowhere else to go. By age 10, she was managing schedules, remembering important dates, and serving as the family's administrative coordinator, while her peers were still learning to tie their shoes. The praise she received for her helpfulness became addictive. The relief on her mother's face when she anticipated a need, the gratitude of neighbors when she volunteered to help, the recognition from teachers when she assisted struggling classmates. She learned that her worth was directly proportional to her usefulness. That love was earned through service. That belonging was secured through making herself indispensable. School became another arena where her caretaking identity was reinforced. She was the student who helped others with homework, who mediated conflicts between classmates, who stayed after class to help teachers organize their classrooms. Her own academic interests were secondary to her role as helper, supporter, and problem solver for others. She received recognition not for her own achievements, but for her ability to facilitate others' success. The religious environment of her childhood further reinforced these patterns, teaching her that virtue was measured by sacrifice, that holiness came through service, that the highest calling was to lose oneself in service to others. She internalized messages about the blessedness of giving without receiving, the moral superiority of self-sacrifice, and the spiritual danger of focusing on one's own needs. Her first romantic relationship had been with someone who needed fixing, someone whose problems provided her with a sense of purpose and identity. She had learned to confuse love with caretaking, to believe that her value in relationships came from her ability to heal, support, and solve others' problems. The relationship ended when her partner no longer needed her services, leaving her confused about her worth outside the context of being needed. The family dynamics that had shaped her continued to play out in her adult life. Her mother's dependency had deepened over the years, creating an increasingly complex web of medical appointments, financial needs, and emotional support that positioned Sophia as the family's primary caretaker. Her sister had learned to rely on Sophia's availability, treating her like a backup parent for her children and a safety net for her various crises. The professional choices she had made were extensions of her childhood programming. She had gravitated toward careers that allowed her to serve others while avoiding the vulnerability of pursuing her own dreams. She had become skilled at supporting others' ambitions while remaining unconscious of her own desires and talents. Her resume was a monument to service, with no entries that reflected personal passion or individual achievement. Her friendship patterns revealed the same dynamic. She attracted people who needed her support while remaining distant from those who might challenge her to examine her own needs. She had surrounded herself with people who reinforced her identity as a caretaker while avoiding relationships that might require her to be vulnerable, to receive support, or to acknowledge her own limitations. The cultural messages she had absorbed reinforced her programming, the valorization of motherhood as complete self-sacrifice, the celebration of women who put everyone else's needs before their own, the romantic notion of love as losing oneself in service to others. She had internalized these messages so completely that questioning them felt like questioning her very identity. The spiritual tradition she had explored often emphasized the dissolution of self in service to others, reinforcing her existing patterns while failing to address the difference between healthy service and self-abandonment. She had learned to confuse ego death with self-neglect, to mistake boundary-less giving for spiritual advancement, to believe that caring for herself was a form of spiritual regression. The moment of reckoning arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, when Sophia found herself standing in the middle of her kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of her endless service to others, feeling more empty than she had ever felt before. The phone was ringing with another crisis. Her mother needed a ride to yet another appointment. Her sister's children required pickup from school, and Mrs. Shun was waiting for her daily visit. But for the first time in decades, Sophia couldn't move. The familiar surge of adrenaline that usually propelled her into action was replaced by a profound stillness, a deep exhaustion that seemed to emanate from her bones. She looked at her hands, recognizing them as if for the first time. Hands that had cooked thousands of meals for others. Hands that had written countless cards of encouragement. Hands that had held space for so much pain and need. But hands that had never learned to reach for her own dreams. The phone continued to ring, but something had shifted in the space between the sound and her response. For the first time in her adult life, she was present to her own internal experience without immediately translating it into action on behalf of others. She noticed the weight of fatigue in her shoulders, the hollow feeling in her chest, the way her breath felt shallow and restricted. As she stood there, motionless, a realization began to dawn. The very thing that had once brought her joy and purpose had become a prison of her own making. The caretaking that had started as a genuine expression of love had evolved into a compulsive pattern that was slowly draining her life force. She was giving from an empty well, trying to nurture others with resources she didn't possess. The irony of her situation became suddenly clear in her efforts to heal and support others. She had become the person most in need of healing and support. The compassion she extended so freely to others had never been directed toward herself. The understanding she offered to everyone else's struggles had never been applied to her own pain and exhaustion. Her reflection in the kitchen window showed her a stranger, someone who had become so identified with the role of caretaker that she had forgotten who she was beneath all the giving. The face looking back at her was tired, older than her years, marked by the stress of carrying responsibilities that were never meant to be hers alone. But behind the exhaustion, she glimpsed something else, a spark of curiosity about what might be possible if she learned to care for herself with the same dedication she showed to others. The phone had stopped ringing, but its silence was more unsettling than the sound had been. She realized that her entire identity was built around being needed, being available, being the solution to others' problems. Without that external validation, without the constant stream of crises to manage, she was faced with the terrifying question of who she was when she wasn't serving others. Standing in that kitchen, surrounded by evidence of her service, but feeling profoundly disconnected from herself, Sophia began to understand that her caretaking had become a sophisticated form of self-abandonment. She had been so busy rescuing others that she had never learned to rescue herself. She had been so focused on healing others that she had ignored her own need for healing. The realization was both devastating and liberating. Devastating because it meant acknowledging that much of what she had believed about herself and her value was built on a foundation of compulsive giving rather than genuine love. Liberating because it opened the possibility that there might be another way to live, another way to serve, another way to love that didn't require the complete sacrifice of her own well-being. As she finally moved toward the phone to return the missed calls, something had changed. The movement was slower, more deliberate, more conscious. She was still going to help, still going to serve, but for the first time in her life, she was aware of the choice she was making. The automatic response had been interrupted by consciousness, creating space for new possibilities to emerge. The catalyst for Sophia's transformation arrived in the form of Dr. Alina Vasquez, a therapist who had been recommended by Mrs. Chun's daughter during one of their conversations about grief and healing. Dr. Vasquez had spent 30 years working with people who had lost themselves in service to others, and she had developed an uncanny ability to recognize the signs of compassionate burnout masked as spiritual service. Their first meeting took place in Dr. Vasquez's office, a space that felt more like a sanctuary than a clinical setting. Warm earth tones, soft lighting, and carefully chosen artwork created an atmosphere of safety and acceptance. Most importantly, there were no clocks visible, no sense of time pressure, no urgent agenda, a novelty for Sophia, who existed in a world of constant scheduling and immediate needs. Dr. Vasquez was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and eyes that held the depth of someone who had done her own deep work. She moved with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who had learned to inhabit her own body fully, who had made peace with taking up space in the world. Her presence was both commanding and nurturing, offering Sophia the rare experience of being with someone who didn't need anything from her. "Tell me about your relationship with rest," Dr. Vasquez began, a voice carrying the weight of someone who understood that the simplest questions often revealed the deepest truths. Sophia found herself stumbling over the question, realizing that she had no vocabulary for discussing rest that wasn't connected to preparing for the next day's service to others. As their conversation deepened, Dr. Vasquez introduced concepts that were foreign to Sophia's way of thinking. She spoke of energetic boundaries, the idea that caring for others required protecting one's own energy reserves. She discussed reciprocal relationships, connections built on mutual support rather than one-sided giving. She explained self-compassion, the practice of treating oneself with the same kindness one would offer a dear friend. "Your caretaking has become a form of emotional bypassing," Dr. Vasquez explained gently. "You've learned to focus on others' needs as a way of avoiding your own pain, your own vulnerability, your own need for care. But the very people you're serving would benefit more from your wholeness than from your depletion." The concept of healthy selfishness was particularly challenging for Sophia to grasp. Dr. Vasquez explained that taking care of oneself wasn't selfish, but essential, like putting on your own oxygen mask before helping others. She introduced the idea that self-care wasn't a luxury, but a responsibility, not just to oneself but to everyone whose life was touched by one's presence. During their second session, Dr. Vasquez introduced Sophia to the concept of differentiation, the ability to remain emotionally connected to others, while maintaining awareness of one's own separate emotional experience. She explained how Sophia had learned to absorb others' emotions as if they were her own, taking responsibility for feelings and experiences that belong to other people. "Your empathy has become a form of emotional fusion," Dr. Vasquez observed. "You've lost the ability to distinguish between your feelings and others' feelings, between your responsibilities and others' responsibilities. Learning to care for yourself isn't about caring less for others. It's about caring more effectively." The homework assignments Dr. Vasquez gave were unlike anything Sophia had ever experienced. Instead of tasks focused on helping others, she was asked to notice her own needs, to practice saying no to requests that felt overwhelming, to spend time each day doing something purely for her own enjoyment. The assignments felt foreign and uncomfortable, like learning a new language. Your body has been trying to get your attention for years, Dr. Vasquez explained during their third session. The fatigue, the headaches, the sense of running on empty. These are messages from your deepest wisdom, telling you that something needs to change. Learning to listen to these signals is the beginning of self-care. The concept of good enough was revolutionary for Sophia. Dr. Vasquez explained that perfectionism in service to others was often a form of control, a way of managing anxiety about not being loved or accepted. She introduced the idea that others were capable of handling their own problems, that rescuing people often prevented them from developing their own strength and resilience. Your caretaking has become a form of enablement, Dr. Vasquez gently suggested. By always being available to solve others' problems, you've inadvertently communicated that they're not capable of handling their own lives. True compassion sometimes means stepping back and allowing others to struggle, to grow, to develop their own capacity for self-care. The most challenging concept was the idea of loving detachment, the ability to care deeply for others while maintaining emotional boundaries. Dr. Vasquez explained that love didn't require losing oneself in others' experiences, that the healthiest relationships were built on two whole people choosing to connect, rather than two incomplete people trying to become whole through each other. Your worth isn't determined by how much you give, Dr. Vasquez said during their fourth session. Your worth is inherent, unconditional, not dependent on your usefulness to others. Learning to receive love without earning it through service is one of the most profound spiritual practices you can engage in. As their work together progressed, Dr. Vasquez began to help Sophia understand the difference between healthy service and compulsive caretaking. Healthy service came from a place of overflow, from having enough resources to share. Compulsive caretaking came from a place of scarcity, from trying to earn love and acceptance through depletion. The people who truly love you want you to be happy, not useful, Dr. Vasquez observed. They want you to flourish, not sacrifice. The relationships that are built on your usefulness aren't actually relationships. They're transactions. And you deserve so much more than transactional love. The first experiment Dr. Vasquez suggested felt like scaling Mount Everest to Sophia, spending 30 minutes each day doing something purely for her own enjoyment, without any connection to helping others. The task seemed simultaneously simple and impossible, revealing how completely she had lost touch with her own desires and preferences. Sophia's first attempt was telling. She found herself in her apartment after completing her usual round of caretaking activities, staring at 30 minutes of unstructured time with no idea how to fill it. She had forgotten what brought her joy, what made her feel alive, what she might want to do if she wasn't constantly responding to others' needs. The silence felt overwhelming, almost frightening. Her initial attempts to fill the time were contaminated by her caretaking patterns. She found herself organizing her medicine cabinet for fun, reasoning that it would help her better serve her mother's needs. She started a craft project, but immediately began planning how she could use it to brighten someone else's day. Even her attempts at self-care were filtered through the lens of how they might benefit others. The resistance she encountered was profound and multifaceted. Her body felt agitated when she tried to sit still and focus on her own experience. Her mind raced with thoughts of people who might need her attention. Her phone seemed to ring more frequently when she was trying to practice self-care, as if the universe was testing her commitment to this new way of being. Guilt was her constant companion during these experiments. Every moment spent on herself felt stolen from someone who might need her help. She found herself bargaining with her conscience. If she spent 30 minutes on herself, she would spend extra time helping others to compensate. The concept of deserving care without earning it through service was foreign to her entire worldview. The first breakthrough came during her second week of experimentation. She had decided to try drawing, something she had loved as a child, but had abandoned in favor of more useful activities. As she sat with pencil and paper, initially intending to draw something that might make a good gift for someone, she found herself sketching the view from her kitchen window. Something magical happened as she became absorbed in the process of observing and recreating the play of light on the buildings across the street. For 20 minutes, she was completely present to her own experience, completely unaware of anyone else's needs or problems. She was simply Sophia, engaged in the act of creating, connected to her own inner world in a way she hadn't experienced in decades. The drawing wasn't particularly skillful, but it was entirely hers. Looking at it, she felt a stirring of something she had almost forgotten. Pride in her own creation, joy in her own self-expression, satisfaction that had nothing to do with how it might serve others. The feeling was so unfamiliar that she almost didn't recognize it as belonging to her. Her next experiment involved saying no to a request for help. A small thing, but revolutionary in the context of her established patterns. When her neighbor asked her to babysit on short notice, Sophia found herself saying, "I'm not available that evening," without providing the elaborate explanation and alternative solutions she usually offered. The words felt foreign in her mouth, but they also felt powerful. The world didn't end when she said no. Her neighbor was disappointed, but found another solution. The children were cared for. The crisis was resolved, and Sophia discovered that her refusal to help hadn't caused the catastrophe she had anticipated. More importantly, she had spent the evening reading a book she had been wanting to read for months, purely for her own enjoyment. Each small experiment in self-care felt like learning a new language. She tried taking baths without multitasking, eating meals while sitting down, going for walks without her phone. These activities felt decadent and strange, but they also began to awaken something in her that had been dormant for years, a sense of her own inner life, her own needs, her own capacity for joy. The resistance from others was swift and predictable. Her mother complained about having to manage her own schedule. Her sister expressed frustration at having to find alternative childcare. Mrs. Chun seemed confused by Sophia's reduced availability. The people who had become accustomed to her endless availability were not pleased with her new boundaries. But alongside the resistance came something unexpected: respect. The people who truly cared about her began to express admiration for her new commitment to self-care. They had been concerned about her for years, watching her burn herself out in service to others, but hadn't known how to address it. Her new boundaries gave them permission to express their care for her well-being. The most surprising discovery was how much energy she'd been spending on managing others' emotions. When she began to practice emotional boundaries, staying present to her own feelings, while allowing others to have their own emotional experiences, she found resources she didn't know she possessed. The energy that had been constantly flowing outward began to circulate internally, nourishing her own spirit. Her sleep began to improve as she practiced keeping her phone in another room during the night. Her dreams shifted from being populated by other people's problems to containing images of her own healing journey. She began to wake up feeling more rested, more connected to her own inner world. The practice of morning meditation became a cornerstone of her new relationship with herself. Just 10 minutes of sitting quietly, breathing, and checking in with her own internal state felt revolutionary. She discovered sensations in her body she had been ignoring for years. The tension in her shoulders, the tightness in her chest, the way her breath became shallow when she felt overwhelmed. The breakthrough came during her 6th week of working with Dr. Vasquez, on an evening when everything seemed to converge into a moment of profound clarity. Sophia had spent the day practicing her new boundaries. She had said no to 3 requests for help, had taken a lunch break without checking on anyone, and had committed to spending the evening purely in her own company. She was sitting in her favorite chair, a cup of tea growing cold beside her when her sister called with a familiar crisis. One of her children was having a meltdown. She couldn't find a babysitter. She had an important work meeting, and she needed Sophia to drop everything and rescue the situation. In the past, Sophia would have been out the door before the phone. Call ended, her own plans abandoned without a second thought. But something different happened this time. As she listened to her sister's distress, Sophia found herself aware of two distinct experiences happening simultaneously. She could feel her sister's genuine frustration and panic, and she could also feel her own body's response. The familiar surge of adrenaline, the impulse to fix and rescue, the automatic preparation to abandon her own needs. But instead of being swept away by these familiar patterns, she found herself observing them with curious detachment. "I can hear how difficult this is for you," she said to her sister, her voice calm and loving but not urgent. "And I'm not available to help tonight. I trust that you'll find a solution." The words came from a place she had never accessed before, a place of love that didn't require self-sacrifice, of care that maintained clear boundaries. Her sister's response was immediate and intense. Anger, guilt-tripping, accusations of selfishness. But instead of collapsing under the familiar weight of these emotional tactics, Sophia found herself remaining centered in her own experience. She could see her sister's manipulation for what it was, not malicious, but a pattern learned from years of Sophia's enabling, a desperate attempt to maintain a dynamic that had become unhealthy for both of them. "I love you," Sophia said softly, "and I'm not changing my mind about tonight. I believe in your ability to handle this." She ended the call gently but firmly, her hand shaking slightly but her heart surprisingly calm. What followed was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Instead of the crushing guilt and anxiety she expected to feel, she found herself sitting in a profound stillness. The apartment around her seemed to pulse with new energy, as if the very air had become charged with possibility. For the first time in decades, she was completely present to her own experience without the background noise of others' needs demanding her attention. She walked to her bathroom mirror and looked at her reflection. Really looked, not the quick glance she usually allowed herself while rushing to attend to others. The face looking back at her was tired, but somehow more alive than she remembered. Her eyes held a clarity that had been absent for years, a sense of someone awakening from a long sleep. The realization that followed was both simple and earth-shattering. She had been trying to earn love through depletion, but the people who truly loved her wanted her to flourish, not suffer. The relationships that required her self-sacrifice weren't relationships at all. They were complex systems of codependency that served no one's highest good. She thought about her mother, how her constant availability had actually prevented her mother from developing independence and resilience. She thought about her sister, how her endless rescuing had enabled her sister to avoid taking full responsibility for her own life. She thought about all the people she had been helping, who had become dependent on her service rather than growing into their own strength. The guilt she had been carrying for even considering her own needs began to transform into something else. Grief for all the years she had spent believing her worth was conditional. Sadness for the self she had abandoned in service to others. And underneath it all, a fierce new determination to learn how to love without losing herself. Standing in her bathroom, looking at her own reflection, Sophia made a declaration that felt like a prayer, a vow, and a revolutionary act all at once. "I am worthy of the same love and care I give to others. My needs matter. My happiness matters. I matter, not because of what I can do for others, but simply because I exist." The words hung in the air like incantation, creating ripples of energy that seemed to rearrange something fundamental in her consciousness. She felt as though she was meeting herself for the first time, greeting the woman who had been buried under layers of compulsive giving and people-pleasing. That night, her sister managed the crisis on her own, finding resources and strength she hadn't needed to develop while Sophia was always available to rescue her. When they spoke the next day, her sister admitted feeling proud of how she had handled the situation, recognizing capabilities in herself she had forgotten she possessed. The breakthrough continued to unfold over the following days like a flower, opening to sunlight. Sophia found herself naturally making choices that honored her own well-being without feeling the need to justify or explain them to others. She began to trust her own instincts about when to help and when to step back, developing an internal compass that had been obscured by years of external focus. Her relationship with time began to shift as she realized that her constant sense of urgency had been manufactured by the belief that others' needs were always more important than her own. When she began to approach requests for help with conscious consideration rather than automatic response, she discovered that very few things were actually as urgent as they had seemed. The most profound shift was in her understanding of love itself. She had believed that love required self-sacrifice, that caring meant losing herself in others' experiences. But she was beginning to understand that the highest form of love was the kind that empowered both people to be their fullest selves. Love that created more wholeness rather than more dependency. The woman who emerged from this breakthrough was still compassionate, still caring, still committed to service. But her service now came from a place of overflow rather than depletion, from choice rather than compulsion, from strength rather than neediness. She was learning to be a healing presence in the world without sacrificing her own healing in the process. The weeks following Sophia's breakthrough were not a smooth ascent into enlightenment, but a complex dance with the parts of herself that had been invested in the old patterns. Like any significant transformation, her journey toward balanced caretaking involved periods of doubt, regression, and the emergence of sophisticated forms of resistance that she hadn't anticipated. The first wave of resistance came from her own nervous system, which had been programmed for hypervigilance and constant availability. Even when she consciously chose to maintain boundaries, her body would flood with anxiety when her phone remained unanswered, when she said no to requests for help, when she prioritized her own needs. The physiological addiction to crisis and urgency was stronger than her intellectual understanding of healthy boundaries. Her inner critic, which had been relatively quiet during the initial euphoria of her breakthrough, returned with a vengeance. The voice in her head became increasingly sophisticated in its attempts to undermine her new patterns. It would whisper that she was being selfish when she took time for herself, that she was abandoning people who truly needed her, that her new boundaries were just elaborate forms of selfishness disguised as self-care. The guilt was particularly insidious because it masqueraded as conscience, as spiritual sensitivity, as evidence of her good heart. When her sister called in tears about another crisis, and Sophia maintained her boundary about not being available that evening, the guilt would arrive dressed as moral certainty that she was becoming cold, uncaring, and spiritually regressed. The people in her life who had benefited from her boundaryless availability began to employ increasingly sophisticated strategies to restore the old dynamic. Her mother's health crises intensified whenever Sophia tried to reduce her involvement. Her sister's emotional volatility increased in direct proportion to Sophia's attempts to establish healthier patterns. Mrs. Chun's neediness seemed to deepen as Sophia's availability decreased. The most challenging resistance came from what Dr. Vasquez helped her identify as spiritual bypassing. The way her ego tried to maintain its identity as a special, enlightened caretaker by reframing her new boundaries as just another form of service. Her mind would create elaborate justifications for why her self-care was actually about helping others more effectively, rather than acknowledging that she deserved care simply because she was human. Sophia found herself cycling between periods of strong boundaries and complete collapse back into old patterns. One week, she would maintain perfect self-care routines and clear boundaries with everyone in her life. The next week, a family crisis would arise, and she would abandon all her new practices, working herself into exhaustion to manage everyone's emotions and problems. The shame about these regressions was almost more difficult than the original patterns. She would berate herself for not being strong enough to maintain her boundaries, for not being evolved enough to resist the pull of her old programming, for not being a good enough student of her own healing process. Dr. Vasquez had to repeatedly remind her that transformation was not linear, that regression was part of the process, that self-compassion needed to extend to her imperfect journey of change. The social pressure was particularly intense. Well-meaning friends would comment on how she seemed different lately, implying that her new boundaries made her less warm, less caring, less like the person they had loved. Family members would share concerns about her selfishness, framing their discomfort with her changes as worry about her spiritual and emotional well-being. The financial fears were also significant. So much of her security had been tied to being indispensable to others. As she reduced her availability, she worried that people would no longer need her, no longer value her, no longer include her in their lives. The prospect of being loved for who she was rather than what she could do felt simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Her professional identity was challenged as she began to set boundaries at work. Colleagues who had relied on her endless availability expressed frustration and disappointment. Her reputation as the person who could handle any crisis, manage any emergency, solve any problem was being replaced by a new identity as someone who was reliable but boundaried, helpful but not self-sacrificing. The spiritual community where she had volunteered presented particularly complex resistance. The language of service, surrender, and selflessness that had once inspired her now felt manipulative when used to pressure her back into boundaryless giving. She had to learn to distinguish between authentic spiritual service and spiritual codependency, between healthy surrender and self-abandonment. Even her dreams became battlegrounds, where her old patterns fought for survival. She would dream about people in crisis whom she failed to help, about disasters that occurred because she wasn't available to prevent them, about being rejected and abandoned because she was no longer useful to others. Her subconscious mind was processing the death of her old identity and the birth of her new way of being. The resistance was particularly challenging because it often felt more virtuous than her new boundaries. The voice that urged her to sacrifice herself for others spoke in the language of love, compassion, and spiritual service. The voice that encouraged her to maintain boundaries felt selfish and cold by comparison. Learning to trust her new instincts required developing a more sophisticated understanding of true compassion versus codependent caretakking. Dr. Vasquez helped her understand that resistance was not her enemy, but valuable information about the depth of her programming and the significance of her transformation. Each wave of resistance was an opportunity to strengthen her new patterns, to practice self-compassion in the face of internal criticism, to choose consciousness over compulsion. The breakthrough came when Sophia realized that her resistance wasn't trying to hurt her but to protect her. The parts of herself that wanted to return to boundaryless caretaking were trying to ensure her survival in the only way they knew how, by making her indispensable to others. Learning to dialogue with these protective parts, to honor their concerns while gently redirecting their energy, became a crucial part of her integration process. As Sophia's internal transformation deepened, the ripple effects began to create waves of change throughout her entire social ecosystem. The community that had organized itself around her endless availability was forced to adapt, evolve, or reveal its true nature. This period of community recalibration was both painful and showing her which relationships were based on genuine love and which were primarily transactional. Her neighborhood, which had functioned like an extended family with Sophia as the unofficial matriarch, began to reorganize itself around more distributed caregiving. Mrs. Chun's isolation, which had been masked by Sophia's daily visits, became apparent to other neighbors who stepped forward to offer friendship and support. The community garden that Sophia had single-handedly maintained became a collaborative effort as other residents discovered the joy of shared stewardship. The transition was not smooth. Initially, there was confusion and resentment when Sophia's reduced availability created gaps in the informal support system. Some neighbors accused her of becoming selfish and abandoning her community responsibilities. Others worried that she was having some kind of breakdown or crisis that was causing her to withdraw from her usual helping activities. But gradually, something beautiful began to emerge. When Sophia was no longer available to solve every problem, other people in the community began to discover their own capacity for helping and supporting each other. Relationships that had been mediated through Sophia began to develop directly between neighbors. The community became more resilient and interconnected rather than dependent on a single person's unlimited availability. Her family system underwent the most dramatic recalibration. Her mother, who had become increasingly dependent on Sophia's management of her medical care and daily needs, was forced to develop new coping strategies and support systems. Initially, this created intense conflict as her mother alternated between guilt-tripping and panic when Sophia was no longer available for every appointment and crisis. The breakthrough came when her mother's doctor, during a routine visit that Sophia did not attend, commented on how much stronger and more independent her mother seemed when she wasn't relying on her daughter to speak for her. This external validation helped her mother recognize that Sophia's reduced involvement was actually beneficial rather than abandoning. Her sister's family experienced perhaps the most significant transformation. Without Sophia as a constant backup, childcare provider and crisis manager, her sister was forced to develop better organizational systems, communication skills with her children, and relationships with other parents in their community. The children, who had become accustomed to Aunt Sophia solving their problems, began to develop greater resilience and independence. The initial period was marked by intense conflict. Her sister accused Sophia of abandoning the family during their time of need, of becoming cold and uncaring, of prioritizing her own comfort over family loyalty. Family gatherings became tense as other relatives took sides, some supporting Sophia's new boundaries, while others pressured her to return to her old patterns. But over time, her sister began to express grudging admiration for Sophia's changes. Their relationship evolved from one of dependency and resentment to one of mutual support and respect. Conversations that had once been entirely focused on her sister's crises began to include genuine curiosity about Sophia's life, thoughts, and experiences that the volunteer organizations where Sophia had given countless hours of service also had to adapt to her new approach. Instead of saying yes to every request and working herself to exhaustion, she began to offer her time and skills more strategically. She would choose projects that aligned with her authentic interests and abilities, rather than simply filling gaps wherever they existed. Some organizations struggled with this change, having become dependent on volunteers who would sacrifice their own well-being for the cause. But others found that Sophia's more boundaried involvement was actually more valuable because it was sustainable and intentional. Her contributions became more creative and effective when they came from choice rather than compulsion. Her church community presented particular challenges because the religious language of service and sacrifice was often used to pressure her back into boundaryless giving. She had to learn to distinguish between authentic spiritual service and spiritual manipulation, between healthy surrender and self-abandonment disguised as devotion. The transformation in her church relationships was gradual but profound. She began to model a different way of being spiritual, one that included honoring her own divine nature, caring for herself as a sacred act, and serving from overflow rather than depletion. Some church members were threatened by this approach, but others found it liberating and began to examine their own patterns of self-sacrifice. Her professional community also had to adjust to her new boundaries. Colleagues who had relied on her, endless availability for covering shifts, handling emergencies, and managing difficult situations had to develop their own capacity for handling challenges. The workplace became more collaborative and resilient, as responsibilities were distributed more equitably. The dating world presented entirely new challenges as Sophia began to attract different kinds of people when she was no longer advertising herself as endlessly available to fix and heal others. She had to learn to distinguish between people who were genuinely interested in her as a person and those who were unconsciously seeking a caretaker for their own unresolved issues. The boundaries also affected her relationship with service providers and community workers. She stopped being the person who would take on everyone else's responsibilities when systems failed. This forced institutions to become more accountable and efficient rather than relying on volunteers like Sophia to compensate for their inadequacies. The most surprising recalibration was in her relationship with her own gifts and abilities. As she stopped using her empathy and intuition to constantly manage others' emotions, she discovered new applications for these gifts. She became more creative, more strategic, more innovative in her problem solving because her energy wasn't constantly being drained by other people's crises. The community that emerged around Sophia's new way of being was more authentic, more reciprocal, and more sustainable than the old system had been. The people who remained in her life after the recalibration were there because they genuinely valued her as a person, not just as a resource for their own needs. The development of mastery in Sophia's new way of being was not a destination, but an ongoing practice that required constant refinement, deepening awareness, and the cultivation of increasingly subtle skills. As she moved beyond the initial breakthrough and resistance phases, she began to develop what Dr. Vasquez called conscious caretaking, the ability to serve others while maintaining her own wholeness and boundaries. The first skill she mastered was the art of conscious pausing. When someone approached her with a request for help or support, instead of automatically saying yes or immediately springing into action, she learned to pause and check in with her own internal state. This pause allowed her to assess her energy levels, her availability, and her genuine desire to help versus any compulsive need to be needed. The pause was initially awkward and uncomfortable, both for Sophia and for the people making requests. They had become accustomed to her immediate availability and responsiveness. Learning to say, "Let me think about that and get back to you," felt foreign and almost rude. But gradually, this practice became natural, and she discovered that the quality of help she offered after conscious consideration was far superior to her old automatic responses. She developed sophisticated skills in what Dr. Vasquez called empathic boundaries, the ability to feel others' emotions without absorbing them as her own. This required learning to distinguish between her own emotional experience and the emotions of others, maintaining compassionate awareness while preserving her own energetic integrity. The practice of empathic boundaries began with simple body awareness exercises. When she was in the presence of someone who was distressed, she would notice what happened in her own body. Did her shoulders tense? Did her breathing become shallow? Did she feel a pulling sensation in her chest? These physical sensations became early warning signals that she was beginning to absorb others' emotions rather than simply witnessing them. She learned to visualize protective boundaries while maintaining open-hearted presence. Sometimes she would imagine a golden bubble of light around herself that allowed love to flow in and out while filtering out emotional toxicity. Other times, she would visualize roots growing from her feet into the earth, grounding her in her own experience while remaining present to others. The art of empowering rather than rescuing became another crucial skill. When someone came to her with a problem, instead of immediately offering solutions or taking action to fix things, she learned to ask questions that helped them discover their own capacity for handling the situation. What you think might work became a more common response than, "Here's what you should do." This shift required overcoming her own addiction to being seen as the solution provider. She had to tolerate the discomfort of watching others struggle while trusting in their ability to find their own way. She learned that her most valuable service was often simply holding space for others. Growth rather than preventing their struggle. Sophia developed mastery in what she came to call strategic service, choosing when and how to help based on what would be most beneficial for all involved rather than simply responding to every request. She began to consider questions like, will my help empower this person or create more dependency? Am I helping because I genuinely want to contribute or because I'm afraid of not being needed? Is this person asking for help or asking me to take responsibility for their life? The practice of receiving became as important as giving in her new approach to relationships. She had to learn to accept help, compliments, and care from others without immediately reciprocating or feeling indebted. This was perhaps the most challenging skill because it required tolerating the vulnerability of being genuinely seen and cared for. Learning to receive began with small things, allowing a friend to buy her coffee without insisting on paying them back, accepting a compliment without deflecting or minimizing it, letting someone else plan a social gathering without taking over the organization. Each act of receiving was a practice in recognizing her own worth and value beyond what she could provide to others. She mastered the art of saying no with love and firmness. Instead of elaborate explanations or apologies, she learned to communicate her boundaries clearly and kindly. "I'm not available for that" became a complete sentence that didn't require justification or negotiation. She discovered that clear, firm boundaries were often more loving than unclear boundaries that left room for manipulation or guilt. The development of what she called intuitive availability was perhaps her most sophisticated skill. She learned to distinguish between authentic calls to service and neurotic responses to others' anxiety or manipulation. Her intuition became a reliable guide for when to say yes and when to say no, when to step forward and when to step back. This intuitive availability required developing a deep relationship with her own inner wisdom. She learned to access a place of stillness within herself, where she could feel the difference between genuine inspiration to help and compulsive reaction to others' distress. This inner knowing became more reliable than any external rules or guidelines about when to help. Sophia developed mastery in holding multiple perspectives simultaneously. She could feel compassion for someone's struggle while also seeing how her rescue attempts might be preventing their growth. She could acknowledge her own limitations while still being genuinely supportive. She could say no to specific requests while maintaining love and care for the person making them. The practice of conscious communication became essential to her new way of being. She learned to express her own needs and boundaries without attacking or blaming others. She developed skills in having difficult conversations about changing relationship dynamics without becoming defensive or aggressive. She mastered the art of self-compassion during imperfect moments. When she occasionally reverted to old patterns of compulsive caretaking, instead of berating herself, she learned to treat these moments as information about areas that still needed attention. Her relationship with her own mistakes became gentle and curious, rather than harsh and critical. The integration of all these skills created what Dr. Vasquez called conscious interdependence, the ability to be genuinely helpful and supportive, while maintaining her own wholeness and integrity. Sophia became more effective as a helper because her service came from choice rather than compulsion, from fullness rather than emptiness, from wisdom rather than reaction. Her mastery was evidenced not by perfection but by consciousness, the growing ability to catch herself when old patterns arose, to make different choices in real time, and to return to center more quickly when she did get pulled into unhealthy dynamics. She became a master of her own healing journey rather than a victim of her programming. The reconstruction of Sophia's life began with small, deliberate choices that honored her newfound understanding of healthy boundaries and self-care. Her morning routine transformed from a frantic preparation for others' needs into a sacred ritual of connecting with her own inner wisdom. She rose with the sun, not from urgency, but from a genuine desire to greet the day with presence and intention. Her apartment began to reflect this internal shift as she slowly introduced elements that spoke to her own aesthetic preferences rather than purely functional needs. A comfortable reading chair by the window, art supplies organized in a beautiful basket, plants chosen for their ability to bring her joy rather than their utility to others. Each change was small but revolutionary, a declaration that her own sense of beauty and comfort mattered. The kitchen, once a staging area for meals prepared for others, became a place where she learned to nourish herself with the same attention she had always given to feeding others. She discovered preferences she had forgotten. She had a love for herbal teas, an appreciation for fresh flowers on the table, the pleasure of eating warm food while it was still warm. Her relationship with technology evolved as she implemented boundaries that protected her personal time and energy. Her phone was no longer an umbilical cord, connecting her to every crisis and need in her extended network. She designated specific times for responding to messages, created an emergency contact system that distinguished true emergencies from routine requests, and learned to let calls go to voicemail when she was engaged in self-care activities. The way she moved through her community changed as she began to operate from a place of choice rather than compulsion. When Mrs. Chun needed assistance, Sophia would check in with her own energy levels and availability before responding. Sometimes she would offer help. Sometimes she would suggest alternative resources. And sometimes she would simply offer emotional support without taking action to solve the problem. Her professional life reflected these changes as she began to set clearer boundaries around her availability and workload. She stopped staying late to handle colleagues' urgent projects, began delegating responsibilities that others were capable of managing, and started saying no to volunteer commitments that felt overwhelming rather than energizing. The financial dimension of her life began to shift as she redirected some of the resources that had been flowing exclusively toward others' needs. She opened a savings account for her own future, began investing in experiences that brought her joy, and stopped feeling guilty about spending money on things that enhanced her own well-being. Her social circle began to naturally reorganize itself around these new boundaries. Some relationships that had been built primarily on her usefulness began to fade, while others deepened as they evolved into more reciprocal connections. She found herself drawn to people who were interested in her thoughts, feelings, and experiences, rather than just her ability to solve their problems. The most significant change was in her relationship with helping itself. She discovered that her most effective service to others came when she was operating from a place of fullness rather than emptiness. When she took care of her own needs first, she had genuine overflow to share with others. When she helped from choice rather than compulsion, her assistance was more creative, more empowering, and more sustainable. Her mother's initial resistance to these changes gave way to grudging respect as she watched Sophia become more present and engaged during their interactions. Instead of rushing through visits while mentally planning the next helping activity, Sophia began to offer her mother the gift of her full attention during their time together. Her sister's relationship with her evolved as Sophia stopped rescuing her from every crisis. Initially, there was conflict and accusations of selfishness, but gradually, her sister began to develop confidence in her own problem-solving abilities. Their conversations became more balanced as Sophia shared more about her own life instead of focusing exclusively on her sister's challenges. The community organizations where she volunteered experienced her transformation as she began to contribute her skills more strategically rather than saying yes to every request. Her service became more focused, more intentional, and ultimately more valuable as she learned to offer her unique gifts rather than simply filling gaps through endless availability. Her living space evolved into a sanctuary that reflected her own taste and needs. She created a meditation corner where she could practice presence, a craft area where she could explore creativity, and a reading nook where she could engage with ideas that fed her own intellectual curiosity. The apartment became a place that nurtured her rather than simply serving as a headquarters for serving others. The transformation in Sophia's approach to caretaking catalyzed a complete renaissance in her relationships, creating space for connections that were more authentic, reciprocal, and life-giving than anything she had previously experienced. As she learned to show up as a whole person rather than a function, the people in her life had to decide whether they were interested in relationship or merely transaction. Her friendship with Elena, a colleague from work, evolved into something neither of them had expected. Elena had initially sought Sophia's help with a difficult project, but as Sophia began to set boundaries around her availability, their interactions shifted. Instead of Elena bringing problems for Sophia to solve, they began to have conversations about their shared interests in art, philosophy, and personal growth. Elena later confessed that she had been intimidated by Sophia's previous persona of endless competence and availability. "I always felt like I had to have a crisis to warrant your attention," Elena admitted during one of their new leisurely coffee dates. "Now, I feel like you actually want to spend time with me as a person, not just as someone who needs fixing." Their friendship became a laboratory for practicing reciprocity. Elena would listen to Sophia's struggles with her family dynamics, offer insights from her own therapy journey, and provide support during difficult moments. Sophia discovered the unexpected joy of being cared for, of having someone check on her well-being simply because they cared about her happiness. The relationship with her upstairs neighbor, James, underwent a similar transformation. He had been one of the many people who regularly sought Sophia's help with various household crises and personal dilemmas. When she began to establish boundaries, he initially pulled away, confused by her new unavailability. But something beautiful happened when James returned a few weeks later, not with a problem, but with homemade soup when he noticed Sophia had been looking tired. "I realized I never gave you anything," he said simply. "I want to try being a friend instead of just someone who takes from you." Their new dynamic revealed aspects of James that had been hidden beneath his neediness. He was funny, creative, and surprisingly wise about human nature. As Sophia stopped rescuing him from every minor crisis, he developed confidence and problem-solving skills that had been dormant while she was always available to fix things. Her romantic life, which had been non-existent for years due to her complete absorption in caring for others, began to stir with new possibility. She met David at a pottery class she had started taking purely for her own enjoyment. He was drawn to her presence, her groundedness, her ability to be fully present without agenda. David's initial attraction was not to her helpfulness, but to her authenticity. He found her interesting, not useful. Their early conversations were about art, travel dreams, philosophical questions, topics that had nothing to do with problem-solving or caretaking. Sophia discovered parts of herself that had been dormant for decades. the relationship unfolded slowly, without the urgency that had characterized her previous connections. David didn't need fixing, wasn't seeking a caretaker, and wasn't interested in being rescued from his own life. He wanted partnership, companionship, and mutual growth. This was foreign territory for Sophia, but it was also exactly what her soul had been longing for. Learning to be in relationship without taking care of someone was a skill Sophia had to develop consciously. When David faced challenges at work or struggled with family issues, her instinct was to jump in with solutions and emotional management. But she practiced simply listening, offering presence instead of fixes, trusting his ability to handle his own life. The transformation in her family relationships was perhaps the most profound and challenging. Her sister, after the initial period of anger and resistance, began to develop genuine curiosity about Sophia as a person. Their phone calls shifted from crisis management sessions to actual conversations where both sisters shared their experiences, thoughts, and feelings. "I realized I didn't really know you," her sister admitted during one of their new, more balanced conversations. "I knew you as my problem solver, my backup parent, my safety net. But I didn't know what you liked, what you dreamed about, what made you happy. I want to know the real you." This shift required both sisters to grieve the old relationship while learning to build something new. There were awkward moments as they navigated unfamiliar territory, learning to relate as equals rather than as caretaker and dependent. But gradually, a genuine friendship emerged alongside their family bond. Her mother's adjustment was more gradual and complex. The woman who had relied on Sophia's constant management and emotional regulation struggled to adapt to her daughter's new boundaries. But as Sophia consistently maintained loving but firm limits, her mother began to rediscover capabilities she had forgotten she possessed. Their visits became more meaningful as they shifted from task-oriented encounters to genuine time together. Instead of Sophia rushing through a list of errands and appointments, they began to simply spend time in each other's company. Her mother started sharing stories from her own life, memories and wisdom that had been overshadowed by immediate needs and crises. The relationship with Mrs. Chun evolved into something closer to mutual friendship than caretaker-dependent dynamic. As Sophia reduced her daily visits, Mrs. Chun was initially hurt and confused. But when Sophia began to visit less frequently, but with greater presence, their connection deepened. Mrs. Chun started sharing stories about her homeland, teaching Sophia phrases in Mandarin, and offering wisdom about life that went far beyond her immediate needs. Sophia discovered that Mrs. Chun was a poet, a former teacher, and a woman with rich inner life that had been invisible. When their relationship was focused solely on practical caretaking, her professional relationships also underwent transformation. As colleagues learned to see her as a collaborator rather than a backup solution for every crisis, she began to form genuine friendships with coworkers based on shared interests and mutual respect rather than her utility as a problem solver. The new relationships that entered Sophia's life were fundamentally different from the old ones. She attracted people who were interested in reciprocity, growth, and authentic connection. Her social circle began to include artists, writers, spiritual seekers, and others who were committed to personal development and conscious living. These new relationships were characterized by what she came to call conscious intimacy, the ability to be close without losing herself, to care deeply without taking responsibility for others' emotions, to support without rescuing. She learned that the deepest connections were possible when both people remained whole and authentic. As Sophia's identity evolved beyond compulsive caretaking, she began to discover new dimensions of her life purpose that were more aligned with her authentic gifts and passions. The work of refining her purpose involved distinguishing between what she thought she should do and what she was genuinely called to do, between service that depleted her and service that energized her. The pottery class that had introduced her to David became more than just a hobby. It became a meditation practice, a form of therapy, and eventually a new avenue for serving others. Working with clay taught her about patience, presence, and the beauty of imperfection. The metaphor of shaping clay became a powerful image for her own transformation journey. She began to see parallels between pottery and healthy caretaking. Both required gentle pressure rather than force, patience with the process rather than attachment to outcomes, and respect for the material's own nature rather than trying to impose external will. The clay would crack if pushed too hard, just as people would resist if she tried to fix them too aggressively. Her pottery teacher, Maria, recognized something special in Sophia's approach to the craft. "You work with clay the way a good therapist works with people," Maria observed. "You're present, patient, and you let the clay tell you what it wants to become instead of forcing your agenda onto it." This feedback sparked something in Sophia's consciousness. She began to explore how her natural gifts for presence, patience, and intuitive understanding could be expressed in ways that didn't require self-sacrifice. She started to envision forms of service that would energize rather than drain her, that would come from her authentic gifts rather than compulsive need to be needed. The idea of becoming a pottery instructor for people in healing journeys began to take shape. She imagined working with individuals recovering from trauma, people learning to set boundaries, others discovering their own creative expression. The pottery studio could become a space for healing that honored both her gifts and her boundaries. She began volunteering at a local wellness center, offering pottery sessions for people in recovery programs. The work was deeply satisfying because it combined her natural ability to hold healing space with clear structures and boundaries. She wasn't rescuing people from their problems, but providing them with tools for their own healing journey. The participants in her pottery sessions often commented on the unique quality of presence she brought to the work. She could offer guidance and support without taking responsibility for their progress or trying to fix their problems. The clay became a medium for their own self-discovery and healing. Sophia's approach to teaching pottery was influenced by her own journey of learning to care for herself. She emphasized the importance of listening to one's own instincts, respecting personal limits, and finding beauty in imperfection. These lessons applied to both pottery and life, creating a powerful container for transformation. Her writing, which had been limited to practical lists and problem-solving notes, began to evolve into something more creative and personal. She started journaling about her transformation journey, initially just for her own processing, but gradually recognizing that her story might offer hope and guidance to others struggling with similar patterns. The blog she started about healing from caretaker burnout began to attract readers from around the world who resonated with her story. She wrote about the challenges of setting boundaries, the guilt that accompanies self-care, and the joy of discovering authentic service. Her writing became another form of service that didn't require self-sacrifice. The speaking opportunities that emerged from her blog allowed her to share her journey with larger audiences. She discovered a gift for helping others recognize their own patterns of compulsive caretaking and inspiring them to begin their own healing journeys. Her presentations were characterized by honesty, humor, and hope. Her consulting work with organizations began to focus on preventing caretaker burnout among helping professionals. She developed workshops for nurses, teachers, social workers, and therapists about maintaining healthy boundaries while providing excellent care. This work felt deeply meaningful because it addressed systemic issues rather than just individual problems. The retreat center, where she had attended Dr. Vasquez's workshop, invited her to co-facilitate programs for people recovering from caretaker patterns. Working alongside Dr. Vasquez and other healers, Sophia found her niche in helping people navigate the practical aspects of transformation. how to handle family resistance, how to maintain boundaries during crises, how to rebuild relationships. On healthier foundations, her role in the community shifted from being the person who solved everyone's problems to being someone who modeled healthy boundaries and conscious service. People began to seek her out, not for rescue, but for inspiration, about how to live with integrity and balance. The garden project she initiated in her neighborhood became a metaphor for her new approach to service. Instead of single-handedly maintaining the community space, she organized collaborative workdays where neighbors shared responsibility for creating beauty together. The garden flourished under shared care in a way it never had under her solo management. Her involvement in local politics evolved from reactive crisis management to proactive advocacy for systemic change. She joined committees focused on preventing problems rather than just responding to emergencies. Her voice became influential in discussions about community, resilience, and mutual aid. The mentorship relationships she developed with younger women struggling with people-pleasing patterns became some of her most meaningful work. She could offer guidance and support based on her own experience while maintaining clear boundaries about her availability and involvement in their healing processes. Her purpose refined itself into what she called modeling wholeness, living in a way that demonstrated the possibility of caring deeply for others while honoring one's own needs and boundaries. She became living proof that transformation was possible, that people could learn to serve from strength rather than depletion. The integration of all these new forms of purpose created a life that felt both meaningful and sustainable. Sophia had moved from compulsive caretaking that burned her out to conscious service that energized and fulfilled her. Her purpose was no longer about sacrificing herself for others, but about contributing her unique gifts to the world's healing while maintaining her own well-being. Within Sophia's transformation journey lived smaller stories, like nested dolls, of healing that revealed themselves as her consciousness expanded. There was the story of her childhood garden, a small patch of earth behind her grandmother's house, where she had learned that growing things required both nurturing and space, both attention and letting go. Her grandmother, wise in the ways of both soil and soul, had taught her that the most beautiful flowers often grew from the compost of what had died and been transformed. "Child," her grandmother would say, "hands deep in rich earth. You cannot make a flower bloom by pulling on its petals. You can only create the conditions for blooming and then trust the flower's own wisdom." This memory surfaced during one of her pottery sessions as she watched a participant struggle to force clay into a predetermined shape. Sophia found herself sharing her grandmother's words, watching as the woman's face softened with recognition. The clay responded to gentle encouragement rather than forceful manipulation, just as healing responded to patience rather than urgency. The garden of Sophia's current life began to bloom with varieties of relationship and service she had never imagined possible. Each boundary she set was like creating healthy space between plants, allowing each person in her life to grow according to their own nature, rather than being overshadowed by her compulsive careting. She planted seeds of possibility in every interaction, not by solving problems, but by trusting in others' capacity for growth. She watered relationships with presence rather than solutions, providing nourishment without drowning. She learned to appreciate the seasons of human connection, understanding that sometimes relationships needed to go dormant before they could bloom again in new forms. The story of the garden became a teaching tale she would share with others struggling to break free from patterns of overgiving. "We are all gardeners of human connection," she would say. "Our job is not to be the sun, the rain, and the soil all at once. Our job is to tend wisely and trust the natural process of growth." In her dreams, Sophia often found herself visiting a lighthouse keeper who lived on a rocky coast where storms were frequent and ships often lost their way. The keeper was an old woman with silver hair and eyes that held the depth of someone who had witnessed countless journeys through treacherous waters. Many people think a lighthouse works by reaching out to save the ships. The keeper would tell Sophia as they sat together watching the beam rotate through the darkness. But that's not how lighthouses work at all. A lighthouse serves by staying exactly where it is, burning bright and steady, offering guidance without leaving its post. The lighthouse keeper never abandoned her station to rescue struggling vessels. She never dimmed her light to save energy for tomorrow's storms. She never changed her location to be closer to ships in distress. Her service was in being a consistent, reliable beacon that others could navigate by. "You've been trying to be a rescue boat," the keeper observed gently, "swimming out to every ship in distress, exhausting yourself trying to tow everyone to safety. But the most powerful service is often the lighthouse service, staying grounded in your own truth, shining your authentic light, and trusting others to navigate their own journeys." This dream story became a cornerstone of Sophia's new understanding of service. She began to see herself as a lighthouse rather than a rescue boat, offering guidance through her example, support through her presence, and hope through her own healing journey. People could navigate by her light without requiring her to abandon her own foundation. The lighthouse visits in her dreams became a source of ongoing wisdom. Sometimes the keeper would share stories of ships that had found their way through storms by following the light. Other times she would speak of the keeper's own needs, the importance of maintaining the light, caring for the structure, ensuring the beacon remains strong and clear. "A lighthouse that burns itself out serves no one," the keeper would remind her. "Your first responsibility is to keep your own light burning bright and true. From that foundation, you can serve for decades rather than burning out in seasons." The final story that lived within Sophia's transformation was the tale of an ancient weaver who had spent years creating tapestries that told the stories of healing journeys. Each thread represented a different aspect of human experience, some dark and heavy, others bright and lifting, all necessary for the complete picture. The weaver had learned that the most beautiful tapestries required both light and shadow, both tension and ease, both individual threads and the spaces between them. "You cannot have a tapestry made only of bright threads," the weaver would say, fingers moving gracefully through her work. "The contrast creates the beauty. The darkness gives meaning to the light." Sophia's own tapestry was being rewoven as she integrated her caretaking patterns with her new boundaries, her service with her self-care, her love for others with her love for herself. The old patterns weren't being eliminated but transformed, finding their rightful place in a larger, more balanced design. The weaver's final wisdom was about the importance of negative space, the places in the tapestry where no thread appeared, where the background showed through. "These spaces are not empty," the weaver explained. "They are essential breathing room that allows the pattern to be seen clearly." Sophia's new life included these essential spaces, times when she wasn't helping anyone, moments when she simply existed without serving, hours devoted purely to her own renewal and joy. These spaces weren't selfish indulgences, but necessary elements that allowed the beauty of her authentic service to shine through Dot as she drifted towards sleep. Sophia carried with her the wisdom of the gardener, the lighthouse keeper, and the weaver, understanding that her greatest service to the world was maintaining her own wholeness while offering her gifts consciously, boundaried, and sustainably to those whose lives she was meant to touch. The embodiment of her new wisdom began to manifest in subtle but profound changes in how Sophia inhabited her own life. Her internal dialogue, once a constant stream of criticism and urgent reminders about others' needs, began to develop a new voice, one of gentle encouragement and self-compassion. She learned to speak to herself with the same kindness she had always offered to others. The way she breathed changed as she released the chronic tension of hypervigilance. Her shoulders dropped, her jaw unclenched, and her breath deepened as she learned to trust that the world could function without her. Constant management. The physical symptoms of chronic stress began to ease as her nervous system learned to rest between crises rather than maintain constant readiness. Her emotional vocabulary expanded as she began to distinguish between her own feelings and the emotions she had absorbed from others. She discovered that she had preferences, reactions, and responses that were uniquely hers, separate from her family's emotional patterns and her friends' needs. Learning to name and honor her own emotions became a daily practice that grounded her in her own experience. The practice of saying no became less difficult as she reframed it from rejection to self-care. She learned that every no to something that drained her was a yes to something that nourished her. The guilt that had once accompanied boundary setting began to transform into pride as she recognized the courage it took to honor her own needs. Her relationship with solitude evolved from something to be endured between helping activities to something to be treasured as essential nourishment. She began to crave alone time, to protect it fiercely, and to use it for genuine renewal rather than planning the next day's service to others. In solitude, she reconnected with aspects of herself that had been dormant for years. The way she received compliments and appreciation changed as she learned to accept praise without immediately deflecting it or using it as fuel for more giving. When someone thanked her for her help, she could simply say, "You're welcome," without launching into an offer of additional assistance. She began to receive gratitude as acknowledgement of her worth, rather than as debt that required more service to repay. Her intuition, long buried under the noise of others' urgent needs, began to resurface as a reliable guide for decision-making. She learned to pause before responding to requests for help, to check in with her own internal wisdom, to distinguish between authentic calls to service and compulsive responses to others. Anxiety. The practice of asking for help became a revolutionary act as she recognized that receiving support was not a sign of weakness, but a model of healthy interdependence. She began to reach out to friends when she needed assistance, to accept offers of help without feeling obligated to reciprocate immediately, and to acknowledge her own vulnerability as a source of connection rather than shame. Her creativity, which had been channeled exclusively into solving others' problems, began to find expression in purely personal pursuits. She returned to drawing, discovered a love for gardening that had nothing to do with providing food for others, and began writing in a journal that was intended for no audience but herself. The way she navigated conflict transformed as she learned to stay present to her own experience while engaging with others' upset. Instead of immediately absorbing others' emotions and taking responsibility for managing them, she could remain compassionate while maintaining clear, energetic boundaries. This allowed for more authentic resolution of conflicts rather than the temporary peace she had created through self-sacrifice. Her spiritual practice evolved from service-based devotion to a more balanced relationship with the sacred that included honoring her own divine nature. She began to understand that caring for herself was not separate from spiritual practice, but essential to it, that she could not serve the highest good while abandoning her own well-being. The quality of her presence changed as she learned to show up fully rather than partially, present rather than distracted by mental lists of others' needs. People began to comment on a new depth in her attention, a quality of being with them that felt more nourishing than all her previous helping activities combined. The transformation in Sophia's life began to create waves of positive change that extended far beyond her personal boundaries, demonstrating the profound truth that self-care is not selfish but ultimately serves the greater good. Her mother, initially resistant to Sophia's new boundaries, began to develop skills and confidence she hadn't needed to access while Sophia was managing every aspect of her life. Mrs. Chen though initially confused by Sophia's reduced availability, began to reach out to other neighbors and discovered a network of support she hadn't known existed. The community that had revolved around Sophia's endless giving began to develop its own capacity for mutual care, with people stepping into helping roles they had never needed to fill while Sophia was doing everything. Her sister's children, who had become accustomed to Aunt Sophia solving their problems, began to develop their own resilience and problem-solving skills. They learned to navigate disappointments, handle conflicts with peers, and manage emotional challenges without immediately turning to external rescue. The children were growing stronger through experiencing appropriate struggle rather than constant intervention. The volunteer organizations where Sophia served experienced her transformation as a gift rather than a loss. A more boundaried, intentional service was more sustainable and effective than her previous exhausted availability. She brought creativity and fresh perspective to her volunteer work because she was no longer operating from depletion, but from genuine enthusiasm. Her colleagues at work began to step into leadership roles they had avoided while Sophia was available to handle every crisis. The workplace became more collaborative and resilient as people developed skills they had never needed to cultivate while Sophia was managing everyone's responsibilities. The modeling effect of her transformation was perhaps the most powerful. Ripple. Other caregivers in her community began to question their own patterns of self-sacrifice as they witnessed Sophia's journey toward wholeness. Women who had been struggling with similar patterns of compulsive giving began to seek their own support and set their own boundaries. Her new approach to relationships began to attract different kinds of connections. People who were interested in mutual support rather than one-sided receiving. These new friendships were characterized by reciprocity, genuine curiosity about each other's inner lives, and respect for each other's boundaries and needs. The quality of help she now offered was profoundly different from her previous compulsive caretaking. When she chose to assist others, her support was more empowering because it came from her strength rather than her neediness. She helped people develop their own capabilities rather than creating dependency on her service. Her family relationships, though initially strained by her new boundaries, began to evolve into healthier dynamics. Conversations became more balanced as family members learned to share their own struggles and listen to Sophia's experiences. The family system became more resilient as each member developed their own coping skills. The children in her extended network began to receive a different model of how adults could care for themselves and others. They witnessed an adult who honored her own needs while still being loving and available. This modeling gave them permission to develop their own healthy boundaries and self-care practices from an early age. Her transformation rippled into her neighborhood as she began to engage with community issues from a place of choice rather than compulsion. Her advocacy for community improvements was more strategic and sustainable because it came from her passion rather than her guilt about not doing enough. The local support groups and therapy practices began to refer people to observe Sophia's example of healthy boundary setting. The journey became a case study in how individual healing contributes to community well-being, demonstrating that self-care is actually a form of social responsibility. Her story began to inspire other helping professionals who were struggling with burnout and compassion fatigue. Healthcare workers, teachers, social workers, and therapists who heard about her transformation began to examine their own relationships with giving and receiving, seeking support for their own healing journeys. The energetic shift in Sophia's presence created space for others to show up more authentically in their own lives. When she stopped managing everyone's emotions, people had to learn to manage their own feelings, developing emotional intelligence and resilience they had never needed to cultivate. Her former pattern of enabling began to reverse as the people in her life learned to trust their own capabilities. Friends and family members discovered strengths they hadn't known they possessed when they were no longer able to rely on. Sophia's constant availability for rescue, the most profound ripple effect, was the permission her transformation gave to other women to value their own well-being. In a culture that often glorifies self-sacrifice, particularly among women, Sophia's journey towards self-care became a revolutionary act that inspired others to examine their own relationship with giving and receiving. The deeper layers of Sophia's transformation required her to confront aspects of her caretaking pattern that were more difficult to acknowledge. Beneath her genuine compassion lay hidden motivations that were harder to accept. The way her helping had sometimes been motivated by a need to feel superior, to be needed, to maintain control over others' lives through her indispensability. She began to recognize the subtle arrogance that had been woven into her caretaking, the assumption that others couldn't handle their own problems without her intervention, the belief that she knew what was best for others better than they knew themselves. This recognition was humbling, but it was also liberating, as it freed her from the burden of believing she was responsible for everyone's well-being. The anger that had been buried beneath years of compulsive giving began to surface as she acknowledged the resentment she had carried toward the very people she had been helping. She had been angry at their dependency, frustrated by their repeated crises, exhausted by their endless needs, but she had never allowed herself to feel these emotions because they contradicted her image of herself as endlessly patient and giving. Learning to feel and express her anger without guilt became a crucial part of her healing journey. She discovered that her anger contained important information about her boundaries, her limits, and her needs. The rage she felt at having been taken advantage of was valid and necessary. It was her psyche's way of trying to protect her from further depletion. She also had to confront the ways her caretaking had been a form of emotional bypass, a way of avoiding her own pain and vulnerability by focusing on others' problems. Staying busy with others' crises had been a sophisticated way of avoiding her own inner work, her own healing, her own need for growth and development, not the perfectionism that had driven her. Compulsive helping was revealed as a defense against the vulnerability of being human, of having needs, of being imperfect. She had tried to earn love through flawless service, but she was learning that authentic love required showing up as imperfect, needy, and human. Her identity had been so completely built around being helpful that she had to grieve the loss of this role, even as she celebrated her freedom from it. There was genuine grief in releasing the identity that had given her purpose and recognition for so many years. She had to learn who she was beyond her usefulness to others. The shame she felt about having needs, about being human, about requiring care and support began to transform as she recognized these feelings as universal, human experiences rather than personal failures. She was not broken for needing care. She was beautifully, perfectly human. As Sophia integrated her shadow aspects, she began to discover deeper layers of her authentic self that had been obscured by decades of focusing on others' needs. Her soul's true calling began to emerge, not as a caretaker who lost herself in service, but as a healer who could serve from wholeness, a teacher who could share wisdom from her own integration journey. She discovered that her gift was not her endless availability, but her capacity to hold space for others' growth without trying to fix or rescue them. This was a much more sophisticated form of service that required her to be centered in her own strength while remaining open to others' experiences. Her creativity, which had been channeled exclusively into solving practical problems, began to find expression in more artistic and spiritual pursuits. She started painting again, not to create gifts for others, but to express the beauty she was discovering in her own inner world. The paintings became a visual record of her transformation journey. The spiritual dimension of her life deepened as she learned to serve from a place of love rather than fear, from abundance rather than scarcity. She began to understand that taking care of herself was actually a form of service to the divine, a way of honoring the sacred life force that flowed through her. Her relationship with work evolved as she began to align her professional life with her authentic gifts rather than simply filling roles where she could be helpful. She discovered abilities she had never developed because she had been too busy managing crises to explore her own potential. The calling to mentor other caregivers began to emerge as she recognized that her healing journey had equipped her to guide others who were struggling with similar patterns. Her own experience of transformation became a gift she could offer to the world, not through endless availability, but through conscious, boundaried sharing of her wisdom. Her connection to nature deepened as she learned to receive nourishment from the earth rather than trying to be the earth for everyone else. She spent time in gardens and forests not to plan how she could share these experiences with others, but to feed her own soul's need for beauty and connection. The practice of gratitude transformed from something she felt she should do to something that arose naturally from her increasing sense of wholeness. She was grateful not just for what she could give, but for what she was receiving, the beauty around her, the love in her relationships, the miracle of her own healing journey. In the deepest phases of her transformation, Sophia began to experience a connection to something larger than herself that didn't require her to disappear into service, but actually called her more fully into her own authentic presence. She discovered that true spiritual connection came through being fully herself rather than losing herself in others. The universal love she had been seeking through helping others was revealed to be already present within her own heart. She didn't need to earn divine love through service. It was her birthright, her essence, the very ground of her being. This recognition changed everything about how she moved through the world. Her understanding of service evolved into something much more subtle and powerful. Instead of doing things for others, she learned to simply be present with others in a way that supported their own healing and growth. Their presence became her service. Her wholeness became her gift to the world. The interconnectedness she had always sensed began to manifest not as enmeshment with others, but as a recognition of the sacred in all beings, including herself. She could love others deeply while maintaining clear boundaries, could serve the greater good while honoring her own needs. Her meditation practice deepened as she learned to rest in the awareness that she was already whole, already worthy, already loved. The striving to prove her worth through endless giving gave way to a peaceful resting in her inherent value as a being of consciousness and love. The wisdom traditions she explored began to make sense in new ways as she understood that true compassion included compassion for herself, that genuine service flowed from fullness rather than emptiness, that the highest spiritual practice was learning to love all beings, including the being she was. Her dreams began to be filled with images of herself as whole, radiant, at peace. The nighttime hours became a time of restoration rather than anxious planning for the next day's helping activities. Her sleep became deep and healing as her nervous system learned to trust that she was safe even when she wasn't actively managing everyone's well-being. The future began to look different as she imagined a life of balanced giving and receiving, of service that enhanced rather than depleted her, of relationships built on mutual care rather than one-sided caretaking. She could envision growing old with dignity, surrounded by people who loved her for who she was rather than what she could do for them. As our story draws to its gentle close, we find Sophia in her transformed apartment on a quiet evening, sitting in her favorite chair with a cup of tea, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose. The phone sits silently on the table beside her, not because no one needs anything, but because she has learned to trust that the world can function beautifully even when she's not managing it. The woman who sits in this chair is the same person who once stood paralyzed in her kitchen, overwhelmed by the weight of everyone else's needs. But she is also profoundly different. Whole where she once was fragmented, present where she once was scattered, at peace where she once was anxious. Her relationships have transformed into connections based on mutual care rather than one-sided. Giving. Her work has become an expression of her gifts rather than a compulsive response to others' needs. Her home has become a sanctuary that reflects her own beauty rather than simply a staging area for serving others. The caretaker within her is still alive and well, but she now cares for the most important person first, herself. From this place of fullness, her care for others flows naturally, sustainably, joyfully. She has learned that the greatest gift she can give to the world is her own wholeness. Tonight, as she prepares for sleep, she carries with her the profound, knowing that she is worthy of love simply because she exists. She doesn't need to earn it, justify it, or maintain it through endless service. Love is her birthright, rest is her privilege, and caring for herself is her sacred responsibility. The journey that began with exhaustion and depletion has led to renewal and vitality. The path that started with confusion about her worth has opened into clarity about her inherent value. The story that seemed to be about giving everything away has revealed itself to be about coming home to herself. As Sophia's story settles into your awareness like seeds planted in fertile soil, notice how her journey mirrors possibilities within your own life. The wisdom she discovered is not unique to her. It lives within every person who has ever confused their worth with their usefulness, who has ever believed that love must be earned through endless giving. Feel how her transformation resonates in your own body, your own heart, your own spirit. The permission she gave herself to matter, to have needs, to receive care, this permission extends to you as well. You are worthy of the same compassion you offer others. Your well-being matters as much as anyone else's well-being. Allow her discovery to become your own knowing. That caring for yourself is not selfish but essential, not weak but strong, not separate from service, but the foundation of sustainable service. Let her courage inspire your own journey toward wholeness. The boundaries she learned to set, the self-compassion she cultivated, the balance she achieved between giving and receiving. These are not distant ideals, but immediate possibilities. Her healing becomes a beacon lighting the path for your own transformation. As you rest tonight, carry with you the understanding that your journey toward wholeness serves not only you, but everyone whose life you touch. When you care for yourself with the same dedication you show to others, you model a new way of being that gives others permission to heal as well. Now, as Sophia's story becomes part of your own inner landscape, allow your body to begin its journey toward rest. Feel yourself sinking deeper into comfort, like settling into the most nurturing embrace you've ever experienced. Your breathing naturally slows and deepens as you release the day's concerns into the capable hands of night. Each exhale carries away any tension, any worry, any sense that you must be constantly available to solve everyone's problems. Each inhale brings in the gentle, knowing that rest is your right, that sleep is your sanctuary. Feel your muscles relaxing, starting with your face, letting go of any expression except peaceful contentment. Your shoulders drop away from your ears as you release the weight of carrying everyone else's burdens. Your arms rest heavily at your sides, no longer needed to reach out and fix, help, or rescue. Your heart rate slows to the rhythm of someone who knows they are safe, loved, and worthy of care. Your mind grows quiet as you release the endless mental lists of others' needs, trusting that morning will bring fresh energy for conscious, boundaried service, like Sophia learning to trust that the world continues even when she's not managing it. You too can trust that this night belongs to you. Your rest serves the greater good. Your renewal makes possible tomorrow's gifts. Your peace radiates outward, touching everyone whose life you'll encounter. Drift now into sleep, knowing that you matter, that your well-being is important, The caring for yourself is a sacred act. In your dreams tonight, may you experience the love you've been giving so freely to others finally flowing back to nourish your own beautiful, worthy, precious soul. Rest well, dear caretaker. Rest well.